Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Serious, what is the creepiest thing you've experienced that you can't rationalize/explain? Episode 2. I grew up in Mexico City during the time of the horrendous 1985 earthquake. At the time, it was my older sister, my older brother, mom, dad, the dog, and myself. We lived on the upper floors of an apartment building overlooking some hills, stores, and other similar residential buildings. One afternoon, my older brother and I were playing without toy cars on the windowsill of one of the rooms. Can't recall if it was my parents' bedroom or ours. The windowsill, something like this for reference, faced the street and there was busy daytime traffic with all the goings-on of the city below us. The room that we were in was adjacent to the corner of the building, if that makes sense. As we are going about your day, something catches my attention from the corner of my eye outside the corner of the window. Now, we are not street level, and whatever this was, I knew was out of place. I freeze, staring toward the man that is steadily climbing up the exterior wall of the building. As he comes into full view, I get a good look at his features: gray, glassy eyes, pale skin, long hair, long dirty nails, sharp features, as if his jawline, nose, ears, had this sharp angular appearance to them, and his clothes. This is the part that really stuck with me. He had on this long coat, a vest, with a white shirt underneath, and a top hat. I remember thinking that his clothes looked like they were covered in soot or smoke. My gaze is completely transfixed on this man, and I tap my brother's arm, who unbeknownst to all this was still playing next to me, and he immediately looks and freezes in place. It is at this point that the man, who had been staring straight up, stops, turns, and looks at both of us and smiles. Jesus Christ, his smile, his teeth were dirty in much the same way that his clothes were, but they looked sharp, like as if his entire mouth were made of fangs. Still smiling, he raises his index finger to his mouth in a sheet motion. He then turns toward the wall again and continues his ascend. As he passes us by, we both don't recall seeing a rope or any instruments he could have been using to make the climb. My brother runs to get our mom, but by the time she got there, this person was long gone. To this day, we still remember this experience, my brother and I having experienced it, and our mom recalling how struck we were that day. It wasn't years later, perhaps 8 years or so, when one day we are all having dinner, now having moved to a new house in the US, when my brother froze in place and looking toward the living room next to the kitchen said that he saw a very tall, three-dimensional shadow of a man, wearing a long coat and top hat just standing there. Approximately 5 years ago, I had the inclination to look up "dark shadow man in top hat" on Google and was shocked to see this. In 1997 I was a UK student, and as my grades were pretty bad I struggled to get a job for my third-year placement, so I therefore took the opportunity to work and study in America, or more specifically at Black Hawk College, Quad Cities, Illinois. At the time there was a new venture where a local businessperson was looking for international students to live in his new student accommodation at an old convent/girls' school called the Villa de Chantal. Google the picture. To say the place gave the chills was an understatement, and I couldn't wait to leave the place in the end. To set the context, the building was laid out with a wing on each end and a main area where there were small businesses who rented out rooms. I stayed in the wing where the nuns used to sleep, and it was basically big enough for just a bed and desk, but it comfortable enough. The other wing was where the old girls' school was situated that had been closed down about 20 years previously. It had never been emptied though, and still had all these small children's desks set up as if they were still being used, apart from a good few inches of dust. The whole building just reminded me of the hotel in The Shining. I often heard footsteps on the floor below me at night, even though it was just me and a Russian student who lived there, and he was even more creeped out by it than me. However, apart from the ongoing noises, continuously cold rooms even though it was 100 degrees outside, no air conditioning, and relentless sense of being watched and followed was the following. In what was being used as a computer room for us to study, and there was desk situated in front of a stud wall. However, as I was going to be spending a lot of time in there, I thought I would reposition the desk to be by the window. What I hadn't realized, however, was that when I moved the desk it was attached to the wall by a couple of screws, so when I pushed too heavily on the desk it ripped it from the wall. As I didn't want to get caught, I thought I would just leave it where it was. However, when I was about to move it back again, I saw some colored writing behind the wall. With my interest piqued, I moved the desk further away from the wall, and behind there I saw the words that will stay with me forever. In red crayon it said, "The more you worship me, the more I will pray for you." In itself this didn't seem too creepy, but it was the way it was written that did it. It was more jagged rather than smooth, angrier if you will. This me up, and I lived next to this room for a further 8 months. I learnt later that this room was the penance room, which was used by the nuns when they had to repent and seek forgiveness. The second thing that I really hated was the room right above the main entrance that was behind, hired by a small local bridal boutique. During the day it was fine, ladies coming to look at dresses for their wedding and such, but it was at night that it got creepy. The building manager used to shut off the main central building from the two end wings each evening and turned off all the lights for both the main area and the school wing, basically just leaving the lights on in my end of the building. For most of the time I stayed at the Villa de Chantal, I had a girlfriend and a couple of good friends who I liked to go out drinking with. I just turned 21, so I was making the most of it. When I used to go out for the evening, the lights in the bridal boutique would be off. However, every time I came back later there was always a light shining in the room directly onto a wedding dress in the window. At first we all thought it was a bit of a joke by the building manager, and she wouldn't believe me, as when she came into work the following morning the light was always off. It was about 2 months later that we all went out for a party, and the building manager gave me a lift back on the night. Lo and behold, the light was on. She turned very white and said she would have to turn the light off, and asked if I would go in with her. Once inside, through the locked doors, we went directly to the room, but when we turned the handle into the room and walked in, the light was off. It was at this point that her car alarm went off. After that day she never went into that room again and always left work by 5 p.m. I, on the other hand, continued to live there for another 5 months and ensured that I had a lock put on my room door. I heard years later that the building burnt down and is now a primary school. I can't help but wonder if the kids who go there now sense anything, or whether it was just my imagination. I finished a family dinner at a restaurant, and we started driving back to my aunt's house, my fiancé and I in my own car following the others. It was completely dark by then. We were driving through winding back roads when they went around a turn and just vanished. Their car was just completely gone, no sign of their taillights. There was no other road they could have turned onto, and we were no more than 3 to 4 seconds behind them. I finally reached my aunt's house and there was no sign of them. I tried calling my parents' cells, but they went straight to voicemail, not unexpected for that area. Finally, a full 20 minutes later, they arrived. The first thing they said was, "What happened to you? You were right behind us and then you vanished." I asked if they stopped for any reason or if they thought they made a wrong turn. Nope. So, we tried piecing the drive together. A little way after they vanished there was some road work, and they said they drove through the same patch of road work, so they didn't just veer off and take a different route. I checked Google Maps to look at the area we drove through. It showed 3 possible routes from our starting point, all 15 to 17 minutes in length, 7.8 to 9.4 miles. One of them went the opposite direction from the starting point, so that's out. The other 2 routes started in the same direction then branched off, one to the right and one to the left. We definitely both turned right. Even if we somehow split directions here, I don't think it was here when the vanishing happened, because there was no other road. Just allowing for the possibility, it still doesn't explain how we reached home 20 minutes ahead of them and going through the same work zone. It's the strangest thing I've ever experienced. I grew up in a house where weird sounds happened fairly often. Sounds of people walking/running around, doors and cupboards opening and closing. My mom had French doors in her bathroom that she woke up to opening and slamming shut over and over. We always talked about things but were never really scared of them because nobody ever got hurt or anything. Weirdest thing that happened was one night the TV in my room turned on and it was the fuzzy screen as if the cable went out. The volume the TV was at was out of control loud and it made me shoot out of my bed. It was so loud my mom came running in to see what was going on. I was using the remote and it wouldn't turn off. My mom went to the wall and unplugged it, and it kept for about 5 seconds, felt like an eternity. When the TV turned off my mom says, "What the hell, why is it so wet over here?" I went over to the TV and the floor below the TV was soaking wet and there was a line halfway on the TV where above it was dry and below it looked like it was wet. Still have no idea what happened. I have 2 stories. One day I was driving down a major road when I saw a guy walking down it in my direction. My instincts kicked in to furiously wave to him and he did the same, and the light had changed so he ran up to my car and I opened the window to say hi. We realized we had no idea who each other was. But the moment I saw him I was like screaming inside to say hi. It was so weird, like past life stuff. The other story I've shared before but it's worth another mention. I used to live in the house my mom grew up in. It was in Levittown, New York, so it wasn't some cool old house or anything like that. It had a little history, but honestly nothing crazy. I have a ton of stories from it, but those are for another thread. I was driving home super early in the morning after a late night at a bar with friends. I had to park in the street and sucked at 3-point turns so I would pass my house and do a U-I-E, for houses up at the first block I hit. I did my usual turn, and as I drive down past each house, lights would flicker on and off. It wasn't normal and it was still dark out at that point. It was like 4 a.m.-ish, and it was street lamps and outside lights on houses. I quickly parked my car under a streetlight, it flickered. I ran past my mom's car, the light inside was on and flickered. Our outside light flickered. I got the door open, and the kitchen light flickered and stopped. I will always be weirded out by that. When I had my daughter this year the hospital lost power, and it triggered the feeling I had that early morning. We call her a witch, like she sucked all the power around her in the atmosphere, but hey, maybe it's just me. When I was 6 or 7 I was walking with my dad through the store. It thinks it was a hardware store or some kind of warehouse like Sam's. We were towards the back of the store and some people walked past us in the aisle. A man and a young girl. What was weird was the man was dragging the boy between his legs. Like holding his arms and literally dragging him. I found it weird, but my innocent mind didn't really find it that strange. I turned around and I watched as the man stopped walking and the little girl stepped on the young boy's legs. On his calves to be specific, while he was face down. Then the man dropped him on the floor and they both left. The boy made some weak noises, and my dad was very distracted by something else I don't even think he noticed. I remember it so vividly. I never really thought about what might be happening until I got older. I hope that kid is okay, has a man wherever he is now. One morning, I woke up before everyone in my household. It was about 5:30 in the morning. Now, for some context, my house has an upstairs loft that can look down to the entryway and front door from one angle, and into the living room from another angle. I had meandered out of my room and looked down into the living room, because something fell off. In the living room, sitting on the couch and staring out the window was a light gray 20-ish-year-old woman. She did not move nor acknowledge me, but I was frozen in fear. Once I broke out of the trance, I ran to the other side of the loft, where I could look down to the front door. Standing there was a light gray boy, probably in his teens, with his hands in his pockets, staring out the window. He didn't acknowledge me either. I just started sobbing at once until my mom opened her bedroom door and turned on the lights. I told her what I saw, and when we looked downstairs, they were both gone. To this day, I can't walk upstairs in the dark, because it feels like something is watching me from that living room. This might sound trivial, but one time my sister's cat was staying at my house because she was on vacation and I didn't mind it at all. Both me and my mom love cats, and that particular cat didn't really care about humans, wouldn't bother you at all. It was late at night, like 2 a.m., and I was just getting ready for bed, doing my skincare, brushing my teeth, all of that. Suddenly, the cat appeared by the stairs and locked eyes with me. I became paralyzed. He did that weird thing cats do sometimes with their bodies, like he lifted the entire front part of his body and walked like that towards me, never breaking eye contact. A violent chill shook me to the core, one like I have never experienced before in my life. He kept coming closer, doing that paranormal activity weird thing with his body. Another chill. When he was really close to me, he just meowed and started running. He actually did that another night and I got chills again. Such a weird experience. I spent most of my childhood in local woods and hiking with my mother, then became a scout, then a little bit of a survival freak. I felt comfortable and never got scared, even when faced with some obstacles and dangers, to a point of feeling so comfortable and confident, that I would often conquer my favorite mountains in my country during night whilst being drunk. Stupid, I know. These sorts of trips were my hobby and my habit for years, and before the incident I'm heading towards with this I only backed out only once, because I believed an illegal hunting has been going on in the woods and I was just concerned about being shot. On the New Year's Eve of, I believe, 2012, I went with some friends I met that year to a vacation house owned by one of their parents, that happened to be located almost at the feet of one of the mountains I'm the most familiar with, and had approached it 1,000 times, from all the tracks or with no track at all. It's not the biggest peak in my country but a considerable one, just above 1700 m. My girlfriend at that time was supposed to go with us, but she stood me up, and then, much later that night, while we were having some drinks inside, broke up with me via text. Don't remember my reasoning, but I decided to climb this mountain in the middle of the night, went out not worried at all as I did the same thing many, many times, often much more drunk than I was at the time. I also decided to use one of the easiest tracks as it began near my friend's cabin. When I left the mountainside village, and approached the beginning of the actual mountain track, so no more lights a part of my flashlight, I froze for no reason and started to stare at the darkness where the track disappeared between the trees. I stood there for no reason for about a minute before realizing that I am utterly terrified, possibly the most in my life, and that there is something or someone looking back at me. I also realized that I became pretty much sober and was sweating profusely, and I became certain that if I continue, something horrible is going to happen to me. There was just no doubt about it. Honestly, no idea how long I stood there, but finally I turned around and surprisingly calmly went back and went to sleep despite my friends still drinking and trying to comfort me after being dumped. I never stopped my mountain trips, but never before and never since have I felt such an irrational, inexplicable terror, and this certainty of absolute doom if I continue. I get really weird sleep paralysis dreams and vivid odd dreams, but both very rarely. Ever since I was little my dad would calm me down and told me he had sleep paralysis dreams too. When my grandmother passed away I had a dream where I walked into her apartment, and we talked for a few minutes before she left to pass on. The next morning, I told my father about it on my way to work and he paused for a moment and told me that he had dreams about talking to ghosts too. He was a very scientific and rational guy, not given to fantasy, so to hear him talk about this was sort of alarming. He told me his crazy terrifying nightmares lessened after his grandfather passed away, but in exchange he occasionally had dream conversations with the dead. From that point forward I did too. The dead in my dreams never have anything specific they wanted to tell anyone, they just wanted to hang out, or sulk about having to leave things behind here. That honestly feels like the most realistic part. My father died last year, and I dream about him sometimes. I'm not particularly religious or have explanations. I'm not sure what to make of these dreams, so I don't try to rationalize them too much or think about them too deeply. But I also think it is wild that our brains either process reality and dreams in the exact same way, or we both have an extra set of experiences about the world around us. Used to work for a cleaning company that mainly cleaned medical buildings after hours. One day I was working alone around 11 at night when I was cleaning a toilet and very clearly heard footsteps and whispers coming from right outside the bathroom I was in. I came out and said, "Hello," since nobody was supposed to be in there. No reply. That building was always spooky. Had another building, it was a really small dentist's office, like basically a lobby and a single hallway. At the front of the building was the entrance, the back had a door that led down to a basement. Was working with my partner that night, and as we were locking up about to leave, we both heard voices coming from the basement door and it slammed shut. We looked at each other and both said, "Nope, we don't get paid enough for this shit," and left. At the same place, a few months later, my other partner nearly got jumped by some weirdo hiding behind a dumpster. I have two experiences here, one from high school a few years ago and another from not even a month. So, I'll start with the high school story. I went to a prestigious, religious grammar school which has been in top 5 rankings for its exam results come GCSEs and A-levels. It for over 70 years, had a convent where our sister, nuns, used to stay. However, by 2015 they had moved out and into a locally bought house as the old convent was not safe for inhabitation. Termites and woodworm ate through the old wooden joints and supports through the house, which in later years caused the first floor to fall through the ground floor and basement. But that isn't what's important. What is important is that with the convent came a small chapel which my school used often and often opened out for rent for weddings and baptisms, as well as a small graveyard on the school grounds where yes, actual bodies are supposedly buried through the school's first 50 years of history. So, it was open day and usually 2 students were assigned to each area of the school to direct parents and their children who have come in to have a look at the school and its facilities to see if the child wants to go to our school when enrolling in the few weeks after the opening day. My day was going horribly so far. I had been dropped off at the bottom of the road and had to walk half a mile uphill to school in a cold January morning. Where I come from we get hit with North Atlantic storms very often at this time of year, so it's very wet and the air is very humid, and when it's cold it really stings as it slaps against your face in the wind. By the time I had gotten into my high school there was only one area left to monitor and they had misprinted my name badge, which made me angry. That area was the convent, which needed to have its heating and lighting turned on. And that meant climbing down into the basement of the convent as heating and lighting was turned off using the main fuse boxes down there, so I was handed the keys and told to go off and turn it all on, and I would be doing it all by myself as my partner was off sick in the hospital after slipping on black ice. Now, you're probably wondering where I'm going with this, but hold on, we're nearly there. After setting down off and into the convent I managed to find the fuse boxes in the basement and fled back up the rounded stairs as they were from an older part of the building and where once were the scullery housekeepers and house cook used to stay. I had returned back to the corridor which connected the convent and chapel area together and stood off in a corner which allowed me to see down both ways. I'm a paranoid bitch at time. Everything was clear. Then the scream came at me. It was a horrible piercing wail of a thing. The corridor's temperature had suddenly dropped, and I could see my breath crystallize. The corridor floor itself began to shake as something ran towards me from the chapel and left heavy foot marks on the dusty carpet. I fled that area as quickly as I could. When I left the convent there was just a white frosty outline on the door's glass which separated the convent and the school religion department. I stood facing that door as the temperatures returned to normal. Not too long after that one of the RE teachers came along and saw me staring at the door, noticing I was white and had blue-tinged lips, something I hadn't noticed until they took a picture of me and showed me, long since deleted as I needed storage space on my phone. He went off to get the rest of the RE teachers in and they all unanimously decided that groups of parents would only go into the convent with one of those 5 teachers. I was allowed to remain guard outside the convent and was given a hot chocolate. Now the thing is, my high school used to be a boarding school for pupils who lived on one of the coastal islands less than 30 miles away, as it was harder for them to travel back and forth from school between the 1930s, 70s. They now go to secondary schools that popped up in the town around the harbor. There was only ever their word that they heard a screeching phantom scratching and screaming from the convent at nights from places that no one could reach. One of the RE teachers was once one of the school's boarders and knew about this. She confirmed that the spirits of some of the nuns remained, protecting pupils from whatever demon had attached itself to the school, but could never recall an incident quite like mine. In recent years, it's only got worse as my sister was attacked by the same thing and ended up with a broken nose and a chipped tooth. People are not allowed into the convent anymore, and my sister has said they have seen priests enter and leave the convent many times over the past few months up until quarantine came into effect here in the UK and Northern Ireland. But the thing is, no one knows what it is or can rationalize it. It will be a mystery for a long time. The second is the much more recent one that has happened to many family members in the past, but most recently me. I had been relaxing in bed one Sunday morning, 2 a.m. as I find trouble sleeping at normal times like 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. It was a quiet night, the moon was out full, and I could see the stars, not a cloud in the sky and no wind at all. So, what happened was quite weird. I heard a loud thud against my window and part of my wall. I got up and went to my aunt's room and asked her if she had heard it as it shook my entire room. She heard nothing. So, I uneasily went open and checked my view. There was nothing there except for a perfectly cut 1.5-inch width tree branch. I looked around at all the other trees in our neighbor's front yard to see if it had come from theirs. It seemed to have come from the topmost branch of my immediate next-door neighbor's tree. There is no logical reason for why the branch cut was so perfect like it had been sawed, as I heard nothing and saw no one or evidence of anyone out in the garden, and it was too quiet as there was no wind. That branch could not have possibly been wind fallen or thrown by a person. It was the next day that things became clearer. I woke up to my aunt on the phone to her cousin. My great-uncle had passed away in the night. My aunt asked what time to her cousin, and I replied with 2 am. Her cousin, who was doing this over FaceTime, looked at me in shock and asked me how I knew. The thud was all telling. Now, as you saw in my first story, I made note that I am a UK citizen. I live in Northern Ireland, and in Ireland we have the legend of the Banshee. What she looks like is unknown, as it always changes from family to family and or person to person depending on the bloodline of the family. Her appearances, if you see her, range from a drowned newlywed bride to an old crone. I have heard many stories from friends who have had visits in the past, such as a young adult in a white night dress surrounded by 7 hounds and 12 horsemen, to a middle-aged woman carrying cloths covered in blood and screaming at people. Saw a partially corrupted image before my friend's phone battery mysteriously exploded. My experience and my family's experience, however, has been the same for the better part of a century. A distant relative like a cousin or great aunt or uncle dies, there is a loud thud at our window. It has happened to my great-grandmother, her daughter, my grandmother, my mother, and now myself. I'll never be able to explain or understand why we get off with just a knock when she chose to show herself in haunting detail to others.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.